live in a highly globalized world. For us, the intersection, interaction, overlap, even conflict between cultures is nothing out of the ordinary. It is commonplace and often something we take for granted in our day-to-day lives. However, these contact zones, as they are called between cultures, the spaces where cultures intersect, interact, and influence each other very often, these contact zones become very interesting when we look at them in terms of their power dynamics. When we look at the interactions of cultures across the world, it becomes imperative to look at colonization. Colonization is an example of one culture almost completely dominating another culture, where there are vestigial influences of the dominated culture, but overall it is shaped and radically restructured by the colonial culture. Colonization therefore creates a sort of liminal space where the intersection between these two cultures is not quite clear. The boundary between them is not quite clear because it becomes uncertain after colonization has passed, especially to ascertain exactly where the colonial influence has remained or where it has radically changed the previous culture. Sometimes it becomes very difficult to go back to a supposedly pure previous culture. Sometimes it is difficult to ascertain what that previous culture even was. The influence of colonization on a particular colonized culture creates very often a dynamic between the two cultures that results in the colonized culture being radically reshaped by colonial values. This results in a hybridized culture. Hybridity or hybridization in this situation refers to a blend or a mix of different cultural identities, practices, traditions, social structures, and in a lot of ways, ideology. There is a crossing or a liminal space or an uncertain interstitial space created between these two cultures where neither of them is left untouched or pure in their previous form. None of them is left free of influence from the other. Postcolonial theorist Homi Bhabha talks about this idea of hybridity. He talks of how when two cultures intersect, there is a power dynamic created between the colonized culture and the colonizing culture, where there is what is referred to as an ambivalent relationship between the two of them. Ambivalence refers to the concept of the colonized and the colonizer having an uncertain dynamic, where the colonizer views the colonized subject as somebody who is exotic because of their difference, but also inferior because of that difference. Therefore, the colonized subject is probably someone whose cultural traditions can be co opted into the colonizer's culture, but also somebody whose cultural traditions can be mocked, derided, often completely erased. At the same time, the colonized subject, the oppressed subject, views the colonizer as somebody who is an oppressive tyrant, somebody who is corrupt, perhaps, somebody who's bringing what foreign ideals were unpalatable to the society previously. But at the same time, because they occupy a position of power, they are also now simultaneously enviable. They are also Therefore, when we look at this idea of ambivalence, where the colonizer views the colonized as exotic but inferior, and the colonized views the colonizer as corrupt but enviable, this results in an uncertain power dynamic. This results in a dynamic where the colonizer might be taking aspects of the colonized culture, such as food habits, manners of production, certain techniques, certain textiles perhaps, just various produce or ways of being that indigenous communities have had previously. The colonized culture might co-opt these into their culture while erasing it in the native culture so that they can continue to assert dominance. At the same time, the colonized subject who is chafing or rebelling against these sort of oppressive practices is also simultaneously imitating the colonizer, trying to blend into or co-opt the way that they dress, the way that they speak in terms of language, in terms of values, in terms of social structures. Imitation is being done to reassert or reclaim the sort of power that the colonizer now holds. So the way to reclaim that power is by imitating the colonizer. And so this sort of mimicry, as it is called, creates a very threatening force for the colonizer. When we look at a country like India, that even prior to European colonization was a very hybridized culture, we can see that there are various levels of hybridization that occur in such a society. There have been hybridized practices that have existed much before colonization and which were actually further hybridized by colonization. When we look at cultural practices, traditions, and art forms, especially in India, this is something that becomes very obvious. The case in point that I will be looking at here is that of what we know as Indian classical music. When we think about Indian classical music, one division that becomes immediately apparent is the distinction made between Carnatic and Hindustani music. Hindustani music is itself a product of hybridization, but not in the post-colonial sense that I am talking about. Hindustani music is a product of the hybridization between various native forms and folk forms of music that were already existing, including Carnatic music itself, and the various Persian influences of music that came in with various Muslim rulers. Hindustani music, however, now is considered as much Indian classical music as Carnatic classical music is, and therefore it has that hybridization has completely assimilated into our culture in a lot of ways. However, the assimilation of Hindustani classical music into Indian culture is another aspect of hybridization that I would like to talk about. Assimilation refers to when a cultural practice that was perhaps not already indigenous now becomes completely a part of the indigenous culture to the point where it is not really distinguished from any previous cultural practice. Hindustani and Carnatic music are now the obvious and ubiquitous forms of classical music that we have in India. Nobody disputes the status of Hindustani classical music as a classical form in India. This is because of assimilation. But now, when we look at not just a pre colonization narrative of classical music, but also the influence of colonization on these two classical forms, which by then had become assimilated into our culture, we see how the notions of performativity of the music, the notions of how it was presented, how it was recorded, and how it was taught radically changed because of colonial influence. One immediate conflict that colonizers had when they came to India was the lack of a general structure for written history. Indian music education, in which is the case in point here, did not really emphasize writing at all. Information or lessons were passed on from the teacher to the student in a purely verbal and oral form that relied on memory and the ability of the student and the teacher to retain the information. There was no notation system. There was no real classification system of the various structures within the music, ragas, talas, instruments. There was no real classification system for these. When colonizing culture came in, Indian musicians realized that they had an elaborate notation system, that they had written records of many of their most fundamental compositional pieces, which is something that in India was completely absent. One part of this comes from Indian music being a very improvisational form. Even in a concert setting, it relies on what we call manodharma or improvisation. Improvisation that comes spontaneously and is based on the general grammar of the music but cannot be pre written or composed by the musician. Whereas Western concert formats rely on polyphonic music, orchestral music, music that has multiple instruments playing often different chords, different notations at the same time. It is therefore much more choreographed in a sense. Indian music was never orchestral in that sense, and so the need for this sort of choreography or notation was simply absent till Indian musicians realized that the orchestral format was something that could be explored. This sort of colonial influence led to Indian musicians therefore coming up with notation systems, coming up with a way to put orchestras together in Indian music. Something that in Indian music, which is monophonic music, music that has one note being sung at one time, where the accompanists only follow the lead musician and do not play harmonies or chords. This sort of music was now being changed or altered slightly to fit this more orchestral method. This sort of intersection between the cultures created an alteration in the performativity of Indian music that is part of the hybridization of Indian music. When we look at other aspects of classical performance, another thing that changed greatly when colonization came in was the advent of the sabha culture. The idea of a concert hall where a performer sat on a stage and the audience sat in allocated seats, very often ticketed seats. This was something that was absent in previous performances of classical music because while they were restricted to certain communities or the access to the music in terms of where you came from, they were not formalized in this sense. They would be performed in open air spaces in the public arenas of the village or the town. And so, this sort of concert hall, a formal setup where performance was the only expectation of that space, was something that was a colonial inspiration. It came from the idea of concert halls in Western cultures. So the instrumentations that were used in classical music, the amplifications that were used in classical music were now modified to suit not open air spaces but rather concert spaces. Microphones were used for both singers and for instrumentalists. Instruments that did not have the amplification power that other instruments had were gradually edged out of the classical music scenario. And so because of these things, the way that classical music was performed, or what was thought of as classical music in the first place, dramatically changed. The veena was an instrument that was primarily used to accompany vocalists in the Carnatic sphere. But because the veena was not as suited to amplification as the violin, which was actually a foreign import, now became the predominant vocal accompaniment in Carnatic music. The violin was much more suited to amplification, and even without amplification, it is a much louder instrument than the veena. It also has some of the qualities that Carnatic music requires. The idea of jaru or a glissade on the string, sliding from one note to another, which is something a vocalist does while they sing, which produces the microtones that are necessary in classical music. These were all things that the violin was able to reproduce, and often reproduce much louder and therefore better than the veena. And so the veena, which was an indigenous instrument that had been adopted from various lute forms of folk culture, and also finally reached this formalized form that was in classical music, was now completely edged out as an accompanying instrument and also sort of faded out as a solo instrument. The violin completely took its place. And so the violin, in a sense, which was a foreign import, completely became assimilated into indigenous culture to the point of erasing an aspect of indigenous culture. Funnily enough, the veena itself had edged out several other folk instruments, instruments that were associated with lower classes or lower castes, and therefore were not given the exalted status that the veena was given, as a symbol of Saraswati, for example. The veena itself, now having edged out so many instruments, was now edged out by the violin. Now, once the sabha culture and technological innovations, notation cultures, all of these things had been assimilated into Carnatic music, the next step was naturally figuring out a way to now co-opt Carnatic music as a nationalist symbol and therefore as a resistance against colonization. So, having taken various colonial aspects, having mimicked these colonial aspects of Western music into Indian classical music was now using these Western methods of being to use Carnatic music as a nationalist symbol. This sort of thing has been referred to as cultural brokerage. Now, cultural brokerage is the idea that you take a modernized or a colonial facet of society or social structures in order to preserve one's own indigenous culture. And so the notion of classical purity, or the idea of what classical music was as an exalted and high form of art, now relied entirely on colonial structures. It no longer had the same indigenous notions of purity, but it was rather colonial notions of purity that were now being co-opted to make Carnatic music a nationalist symbol. So through this historical context, one thing that we can observe is that the idea of hybridity or ambivalence in Indian classical music is a very mixed bag. On one level, all classical music in India is a hybrid form because it comes from various folk traditions that were then later assimilated into the classical framework of rules. Largely, classical music is differentiated from non-classical music by its adherence to rules, by this idea that there is a grammar of every form of music. This grammar was not existent in these folk forms, but the same folk forms were now taken into classical music and put into this grammatical framework in order to become classical. So compositions like Padavarnams, Javalis, these were all lyrics or compositions that were much previously existing in indigenous communities, composed by people across castes, often from lower castes. And so when Savarna people adopted these forms into classical music, what ended up happening was that the people who were the original owners or composers of these forms or these songs were now alienated from their own music because it had now suddenly become co-opted into this rule-bound grammatical structure that was supposedly classical. Now, having looked at this historical context and this complication that classical music presents to us, we now have, in an increasingly globalized world, the outright mixing of Western forms with classical forms. Not in the sense of taking structures from Western music, but rather taking Western music itself into the classical fold. This is what we refer to as classical fusion, which is a trend that has been quite popular in the last couple of decades. Now, the idea of classical fusion is nothing new. Pandit Ravi Shankar, for example, produced a lot of collaborations in the form of fusion albums with Western musicians. The interesting thing about these collaborations is that many of these musicians later said that they were happy to be able to bring the spirituality of the Orient into their performance. A lot of them ended up learning Hindustani classical music because they believed it brought a dimension of spirituality that could come only from the Orient into their music. This is fundamentally an exoticization of Oriental culture. It is a homogenization of what Oriental culture is viewed as, that the East in the world is a place where spiritual beliefs are rampant or a place where one goes to for self-discovery. And so this idea of Indian classical music came from way back then, where the inferior music was still viewed as something exotic. Western audiences very often gave the feedback that they did not understand the music, but it made them feel that something special or exotic was happening, that it sounded so beautifully other. And so this is one sort of ambivalence. On the other hand, Indian classical musicians largely viewed Western classical music as much inferior to Indian classical music, in the sense that they truly believed that Indian classical systems of classification or of the manner of presenting music, of improvisational forms, of percussion, of rhythmic forms, all of these were supposedly, in their eyes, far superior to the systems that the West had in place. But at the same time, the validation that Indian classical music was now getting on an international stage, that validation was essential for us to view our own music as now world class. And so at the same time, although Indian classical musicians viewed Western music as inferior and corrupt, at the same time, it was still given that exalted status as being able to lift Indian classical music out of just the boundaries of India and taking it to an international stage. So it was still something to aspire to because of the power that it conferred on Indian classical music. This sort of ambivalent relationship is very characteristic of fusion. This aspirational connotation of fusion, where fusion is something that is considered different, unique, something that is bringing a new perspective into classical music. This is not something found in our view on light music or pop music. This is something that perhaps comes from the collaboration of classical music, not with any random folk or indigenous form, but rather with Western music in particular. The ability to play Carnatic classical music on a guitar, or the ability to put a drum track in the background of a Carnatic kriti instead of, say, a traditional percussion accompaniment. This is something that is viewed as a truly genre blending kind of music. Film music uses these structures all the time. It uses basis of ragas, for example, to compose songs with instruments that come from all over the world, not specifically classical instruments. But film music isn't considered fusion. So when classical music solely is presented with Western influence, that is somehow considered fusion. So various trending pieces of classical fusion have been either the performance of Carnatic classical music or Hindustani classical music on instruments that are generally considered foreign, or the presentation of foreign music, maybe English pop music. Ed Sheeran's Shape of You, for example, was by various Carnatic classical troupes or fusion troupes, was presented in a classical form. And so this classicalization of Western music is another form of fusion that exists. Another form of fusion that exists is mashups between pop songs, especially in English, and with classical songs like kritis or varnams or whatever else. And so these various forms of fusion are what is actually considered this aspirational form of fusion that is supposedly bringing a new perspective into classical music. Now, this perhaps comes from a continued neo-colonial bias. Just because colonization has left us does not mean that we have abandoned colonization. For us, music that comes from across the border, especially from the West, and now more recently from America specifically, music that comes from the USA is now music that can more easily be given a global stage. It is world-class music in a way that supposedly pure Indian music can never be. And so the access that fusion is given, or the spread and reach that fusion is given, is far more than, say, a pure classical concert will be given. Ed Sheeran's Shape of You, presented in Carnatic form, will get millions of views more than a Carnatic classical concert. And so this sort of reach comes largely from a world that looks to pop music as the ideal. Now, the interesting ambiguity that fusion music finds itself in is that its goals or its motivations come from two very radically opposite viewpoints. One viewpoint, largely practiced by musicians in India who have been trained in classical music and have later in life been exposed to Western pop music. Now, musicians like Harish Sivaramakrishnan from Agam talk about how they wish to bring classical music, which has traditionally in India been a very exclusive form, caste exclusive, class exclusive, generally considered high art and therefore not part of mass culture. They want to bring this music that used to be given that status into a mainstream audience. And so the youth of India currently, who are rather uninterested in classical music, are more likely to accept classical music if it is presented to them in fusion format. And so music by Agam, a kriti like Manavyala Kinchara in Raga Nalinakanti, which comes from Carnatic classical music, was composed by Tyagaraja. The rendition of Manavyala Kinchara by Agam has millions of views more than the rendition of Manavyala Kinchara by M.S. Gopal Krishnan on the violin, for example. And so it is evident that the reach that fusion music gets because of its influence of Western popular culture is far more than the reach that pure classical music supposedly gets. And so that is one goal of fusion, reconnecting an Indian audience with their roots, but breaking the rigidity and exclusiveness of the existing form of classical music at the same time. Now, another goal of fusion. This comes from a musician who is perhaps an NRI or a musician that was not exposed to Carnatic or Hindustani classical music in their formative years. Perhaps they grew up with pop culture. Sushila Raman is an example of such a musician. She talks of how, for her, exploring fusion dimensions in her music is a way of reconnecting with her lost or detached cultural roots. It is a way of reconnecting with her Indian heritage. And so this conforms to the view of classical music as a nationalist symbol, as a symbol of cultural heritage. And so the co-option of this symbol into the music that would have otherwise been just Western is now a way for that musician to assert that they too are part of this heritage. And so it completely does not take into account the Harish Sivaramakrishnan side of things, where he is concerned about the exclusivity or the rigidity of the form. This viewpoint does not look at that exclusivity. It is purely looking at what that music can do for the self in terms of reconnecting. At the same time, it is also looking at how, for a Western audience or for an equally detached Indian audience in the West, this music is a way of now bringing them back to their heritage as well, where they are looking now at their classical heritage not as something distant and pure and alien perhaps, but rather as something much more familiar because it comes in with the packaging of something more familiar. And so this ambiguity or this inherent contradiction between the two goals of fusion that are most often talked about is very interesting. Now, Carnatic music fundamentally has always had this caste colonization conundrum where it is stuck in this midpoint between trying to reclaim itself as a symbol of India's heritage, but at the same time trying to pretend that it does not come from a legacy of exclusion. It comes from a legacy of appropriating folk forms. It comes from a legacy of leaving out people. But in order to present itself as a symbol of India's cultural heritage, it cannot carry that baggage. Fusion is viewed as an easy way out of that baggage. But when fusion has its own baggage, we have to think about where we end up. Indian classical music has always had a history of edging out its own. The mridangam, for example, a popular percussion instrument in Carnatic music, edged out the parai and the tawil because they were associated with low caste communities and therefore not suited to the exalted classical form. But the mridangam itself now has been edged out in a lot of ways by the drums, for example. You will find a lot of spiritual collectives on YouTube and Instagram producing bhajans, devarnamas, and kritis that are devotional pieces of music presented entirely in the Carnatic classical form, except for the fact that the instrumentation in the background is now a keyboard and a drum rather than maybe a flute or a veena or a mridangam. And so, interestingly, Indian musicians, instrumentalists especially, are finding themselves edged out by these Western instruments. And so, this sort of constant push and pull that is taking place is a facet of ambivalence and hybridity that I wanted to discuss in Indian classical music, specifically in the fusion form.